Now for today's program. Daniel Gordis is Correct Distinguished Fellow at Shalem College in Jerusalem. He is the author of 13 books and the widely read blog and podcast, Israel from the Inside. His book, Israel, A Concise History of a Nation Reborn, received the 2016 National Jewish Book of the Year Award. His writing has appeared in magazines and newspapers, including the New York Times, the New Republic, and Time, among many others. His most recent book, Impossible Takes Longer, 75 years after its creation, Has Israel Fulfilled Its Founders' Dreams, was published earlier this year. In 2014, the Jerusalem Post listed Daniel as one of the world's 50 most influential Jews. Amy E. Schwartz is Moment Magazine's opinion and book editor, as well as editor of the magazine's popular Ask the Rabbi section. Before coming to Moment, Amy was a longtime editorial writer and op-ed columnist at the Washington Post, where she was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in commentary. Amy is president of the Non-Denominational Jewish Study Center in Washington, D.C., and is editor of the book, Can Robots Be Jewish? And Other Pressing Questions of Modern Life. Please welcome Daniel Gordis and Amy E. Schwartz.
Daniel, Professor Gordis, I'm so pleased to speak with you. And I hope everything in Israel is going, what do we say now, as well as can be expected?
That's what we say, yes. Well, thank you very much, Amy, for having me. It's really an honor and a privilege, and I look forward to our conversation.
It's, as Suzanne said, you are the distinguished author of many books, but the real reason I wanted to have this conversation was because I've been reading Israel from the Inside. Your Suzanne called it a blog and a podcast. I wasn't sure I could call it a blog. It's also
you can call it a blog.
A newsletter.
A Substack or a blog, whatever.
Right, and there's some clips embedded in there. And I find it really just gripping reading, particularly when the clippings that you include from the news and from Israeli commentary and comedy with where your team, I guess, takes Israeli Hebrew language news and takes the trouble to add English subtitles so we can actually sort of listen in. As I think is part of your purpose, is it gives both a great sense of immediacy to the American viewer and also a sense of how difficult it is to of distance. So I wonder, would you start by sort of sharing how you came to launch this project and what the need was and what it's all about? Why Israel from the inside?
Sure. Thanks for asking. The need and the nature of the project, and I think the purpose of the project, have changed dramatically since it started. But we can talk about when it started. When it started, it was May of 2021. I had read about Substack a little bit in the New York Times, actually. I'd never heard of it. And then I heard that Andrew Sullivan had a little bit of a kerfuffle with, I think it was New York Magazine he used to work for. And he announced, I'm done with New York Magazine. I'm going to go on to Substack, and that's going to be my full-time job. And I read that, and I go, okay, what's Substack? And I Googled it. And I thought, okay. Then there was a fascinating article in the New York Times about a woman who writes a Substack that I still get called Letters from an American. And she's a professor, if I'm not mistaken, at Boston College. This was during the Trump era. She's
a classmate of mine, by the way.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
She's unbelievably talented writer and very gifted analyst. And she was writing for people like herself who didn't have PhDs in political science. In other words, she was writing, she said, mostly for women, although I'm sure by now it's read by everybody. People her age, not young people, but people that would actually read not a long form essay, but certainly longer than a tweet. And she was trying to give people a way of understanding what was happening in the Trump America by giving them context. Here's how issue X used to be handled. Here's how issue Y would normally be handled. She was clearly not a Trump fan. That was pretty obvious, but I thought she was very fair and it was fascinating. And then they talked a little bit about how her thing had taken off. And I was like, I really got to check this Substack thing out. Now, in early 21, we were still in the tail end of COVID. And prior to COVID hitting, I used to go to the States about 11 times a year. To speak, to do work for Shalem College. There's usually an amalgam. And that kind of kept my finger in the American Jewish pie a little bit. And so therefore, when books would come out, I had a kind of a way of beginning to spread the word. But then COVID hit, I stopped traveling completely. And I realized, by the way, that even when COVID was over, I didn't want to go back to 11 times a year. I just wasn't that young anymore. And it was exhausting. We have grandchildren. Well, then we had all of our grandchildren in America, and now we have some there, some here. We wanted to be very helpful here. But then I began to ask myself, well, what am I going to do? I had this book brewing, this book called Impossible Takes Longer, which was supposed to come out for Israel's 75th anniversary, which was supposed to be this great celebration. We didn't quite know about judicial reform. We didn't quite know about October 7th, obviously. And I was actually thinking about what should I do? And I thought, you know what? I read about this Sullivan guy, and I read about this woman who's this very successful professor at Boston College. Maybe I'll do a Substack. And I had done a thing online a long time ago, and I had downloaded the list of, the email list, which was some number of thousands of people. And I thought, I can upload that. I'd already checked. You can upload that list and start, not from scratch.
Do you want to give one sentence for anyone who maybe doesn't know what Substack is?
Yeah, so Substack is actually a publishing platform. You can check it out. I imagine by this point there's thousands of people who write on Substack. Barry Weiss writes on Substack and is unbelievably successful. Andrew Sullivan writes on Substack and is unbelievably successful. And then there are mortals like me, who write on Substack, and we do our little thing. And I thought, it's very convenient. You can't control a lot about the formats. Everything comes out looking pretty nice because they've set up the format and whatever. And I said to myself, that's probably a good way to go since it's still the tail end of COVID and I want to get the word out about the book. To start writing. And what I really wanted to do, though, was not join the pile-on that was basically politics and conflict. There's just so much being written about politics and conflict. And I don't think anybody falls in love with Israel. Certainly, I don't think anybody that made Aliyah came here because they fell in love with the politics or the conflict. They came despite the politics and despite the conflict. And then the question became, well, what did you fall in love with? What's in the ether? What's in the air that is so unbelievably compelling? And to me, it was really what I call the mosaic of Israeli life. People who have different views about all sorts of things, the way in which literature interacts with history, interacts with poetry, interacts with music, and then is reflected in an op-ed. Just a whole civilization that really doesn't come across in even the very, very excellent English language press. That there's just too much. And when I get Yediot Achronot and Makor Rishon, let's say, on Shabbat, on Friday after Friday, they come on Friday, obviously, not Shabbat. I mean, we're talking about something that is just as thick as the Sunday New York Times. I mean, literally. So to go through all of that is a full day's work on Shabbat. And there's a lot in there that just, Times of Israel and J-Post and Haaretz and Moment and Forward and great publications just can't dig that deep. And I thought, wouldn't it be fun to kind of give a window or a lens onto the Israeli soul by talking about what it is that Israelis are really talking about? So even if it's just an op-ed, translate the op-ed or summarize the op-ed, something that's not going to be in Times of Israel, we're not going to get covered in Moment, just because it's just off the main track a little bit, but that I think is really, super important. So I kept thinking, okay, I'll do that. And then I said, no, nobody's going to read that. And then I kept saying, okay, today I'm going to do it. And then I'd say, nobody's going to do it. So May 21 comes around and there's a thing going on in the Temple Mount. I don't know if you remember. And Israel had put security on the Temple Mount. And Hamas, very much in the news these days, announced, if you don't take your security off the Temple Mount, we're going to launch rockets at Jerusalem. So I kind of laughed. Yeah, right. They're going to launch rockets at Jerusalem. And I was heading out for a bike ride. And I put on my helmet. I was bringing the bike outside. And my wife said, where are you going? And I said, I'm going for a ride. And she said, you're going for a ride? You've been listening to the news? I said, they're not going to do that. Relax. She goes, well, do you have ID with you? I said, yeah. She goes, okay, good. So when you get killed, they'll know to call me. So I kind of completely forgot about it. And I went on one of my regular rides, and then I was coming back up the last hill to Jerusalem, and I didn't feel like I'd worked out enough. So I made a right-hand turn, and I went to this little Palestinian village, which is very, very much part of Israel. It's really part of Western Israel these days, called Beit Safafa, and that's very hilly. So I was riding in there, and then all of a sudden, in my helmet, I hear this really weird sound. And I couldn't make out what it was, and it didn't go away. I thought it was my phone, but it wasn't my phone. It wasn't my watch. So I actually pulled over, and I took off my helmet, and it's the air raid siren. And I thought, son of a gun, they're actually really doing it. So you're supposed to lie on the side and put your hands over your head. And I thought, that's just ridiculous. But I was in this Arab village, and people are looking at me like, buddy, you're in the wrong place because you're not coming in our house, but you really shouldn't be outside. So I just figured, the likelihood that anything's going to happen to me is basically 0.0. So I rode home. I got quite the look from my wife, of course. And then I said to myself, self, if you don't start a Substack today, admit to yourself you're never going to do it. And I thought, yeah, that's a pretty good. So by the end of the day, I'd sent out a Substack, and there was a lot of news about Israel because that was the beginning of, unfortunately, one of the regular kerfuffles with Gaza and Hamas, and people, unfortunately, do get attracted to that. But I made it very clear from the beginning, this is not going to be about war, and this is not going to be about politics. And I started to write about poetry and about Israeli novels and about fascinating people who are doing unbelievable things in Israeli society. I mean, the kind of social action work that people do is really unbelievable. So, and you get a kind of you get a different angle. So I interviewed an Israeli Arab woman who unfortunately has since passed away. She drowned, but an unbelievably powerfully engaging personality who was working really hard to help Arab kids get into the Israeli high-tech sector. And they needed extra help. They needed an interview preparation. They needed CV preparation. They just needed help. And she built an amazing program, and she's had tremendous success. I interviewed a woman, for example, who also she went to the Technion, which is kind of Israel's MIT. And she and her husband, obviously both Israeli Arabs and Muslim Israeli Arabs, when they graduated decades ago, you really couldn't get a job in Israeli tech if you were an Arab because it was all security related. And his father had given them 3 gold coins when they got married and said, put these away for a rainy day in case, God forbid, keep these coins. And they sold the coins, and they opened up a business, which is now the world's leading business in brain mapping. And so if you have brain surgery in the United States, what the doctors are looking to see inside your brain is developed by these 2 Israeli Arabs who live in Nazareth, and obviously a huge company now. It's just a great story. Or there was a story of this organization called The Road to Recovery. There was an Israeli man whose brother had been killed actually by a terror attack near Gaza. And he was obviously devastated. And one day he knew a bunch of Arabs, and one Arab said to him, I need a ride to a hospital. Can you maybe give me a ride? I have to get, whatever procedure or injection or dialysis, whatever it was. And he's driving him, and he thought, wow, this is the way to honor my brother's life. And he built an entire organization where now it's not happening right now, but in general, thousands of Israelis each week pick up Palestinians either from the West Bank, or if they've gotten permission from Hamas to come across the border. Now it's not happening, but normally it does, and drive them to a certain hospital. And then there's an app, and it's set up. Some other Israeli picks you up and drives you back to your village. So you don't have to navigate the Israeli transportation system. You don't have to worry, how am I going to get back? And the person that I interviewed for this was a settler. I mean, and he was really out of, central casting, a big kippah, the beard, lives in Gush Etzion, who drives almost every day for these people. And I remember saying to him, like, really, you don't kind of fit? And he said, well, why not? Why does everybody think that I don't fit? I am right wing. I think these lands should be ours, but I don't want Palestinians to suffer. I want them to have lives of nobility. And I have all sorts of theories about how we can make that happen. But in the meantime, they need to get to a hospital. I'm retired. The religious kibbutz lets me use the car to drive them around. And I just thought, these are the kinds of things that people just never hear. So for me, the Substack has really kind of been a wonderful odyssey. I mean, you have to come up with a podcast every week. You start asking around and talking to people and really meeting incredible men, women, Israelis and Arabs, Jews and Arabs, and religious and secular and young and old and immigrants and natives. And I was doing it fairly consistently. There was a written column once a week, and there was a podcast once a week. And it was chugging along quite nicely. Wasn't competing with Andrew Sullivan or Barry Weiss in terms of readership, but that was totally fine. It was never about that. And then October 7th happened. And it became clear to me very quickly that we were going through something here that you cannot understand if you're not here. Even, by the way, if you read Hebrew and you speak Hebrew and you follow all the news, you can't. So I have a son who lives in Santa Monica in Los Angeles. He grew up here. His Hebrew is completely fluent. He went to college here, university, did his whatever. He's Israeli, happens to be living right now in Santa Monica. And a couple of weeks after the war started, he wrote us and he said, I'm coming over. I think he was worried about us. And, not physically, but he was worried that it was very stressful. It's very sad. It's still very sad. And, he's been listening to the Israeli news all day long on his computer, online. And he got here and he was here for about 2 days. And he said, Abba, I knew every single thing that was happening even before I got here. I had no idea how broken this country is. He said, you just can't feel it. And what I've been trying to do over the course of these tragic 117 days so far, and I know the number because Hirsch Goldberg Poland's mother has asked us all to put masking tape and the number on our shirt every day. So on my desk is the masking tape and the pen. And so every day when I come down in the morning and I write a new number, it's a reminder that that's one more day that those people have been there. And it's one more day that those people's parents and siblings and spouses and children are living through an unbelievable hell. So I actually wrote a piece about that little thing with the tape, which I actually find, very powerful and very painful. And what I've been trying to do for these last 117 days, I don't put something out every day, certainly not on Shabbat and very often not on Fridays, but I'd say 4 or 5 pieces go out a week. And as you said, a lot of these are clips, and we can come back to that. But I've been trying to show what's going on in the Israeli press, what's going on in social media, what goes viral on Twitter, on Instagram. I have a very young person who works with me. Otherwise, I'd have no idea what goes on Instagram, but she's excellent. And she finds me all this fabulous stuff. And she's the one that does the translating and the subtitling. So this is stuff that if you don't read Hebrew, A, you won't know that it's there, and B, you wouldn't have access to it. So we've been trying to, as we call it, Israel from the inside. What do you get if you speak the language and you get the newspaper and you're on all these Twitter accounts? What are you going to hear about what's happening to the soul of this country in what is without question the worst year that it's ever had in its history? What are you going to what can I do to kind of open up a little window for you, the reader? That's what I've been trying to do. And the response has been positive. It's getting a lot more readers. But to me, what matters is giving people who do care access to some of the soul of this country that otherwise, even with the fabulous English publications that are out there, one of which obviously you work for, and it's terrific.
Thank you.
You wouldn't be able to have access. So I'm trying to open up that window and let people peek in a little bit.
Yeah, no, thank you for telling all those stories to start with. But I'm glad you segued to that, because that's really, to me, sitting here, not being in Israel that often, I'm fascinated by this gap you identified, which you're obviously not the first person to notice this, but even from the narrower political point of view, there's I've heard descriptions of a mediascape where really even Anglophone journalists, right, in America or even in Israel, they go around and they talk to Anglophone sources,
right,
and they read Anglophone versions of Israeli newspapers. Even in this household, we read Haaretz English every day, and I have been told that that's actually not even that close a correspondence to what's appearing in Haaretz Israel.
It's a completely different newspaper.
Yeah.
There is translation of some, but it's a different newspaper altogether. And I'm not exaggerating, it's probably 5% of what's in the regular Haaretz on a weekday, and much less than that on the weekend, because Haaretz, like the others, like the New York Times or the Washington Post, is a batch of stuff. So yeah, you get a little bit of a glimpse, but it's really not a real glimpse.
So, I don't want to take this entirely political, because obviously your whole intention is to get away from that. So I apologize. But I have heard, I can't remember if this was your specific critique or that of others, but the effect of that is that Anglophone readers get access to certain parts of Israel in great depth. But what about, can you quickly characterize the parts of Israel that they're not having any access to? Who are the people who are,
Right. So look, I mean, so first of all, let me say about, since you mentioned politics, you can't not talk about politics during the judicial reform era. You just can't. But what I made sure to do was I interviewed Moshe Koppel, who works for the Kohelet Forum, who was the author, basically, of the proposed judicial reform, which I was personally very much opposed to. And I made it very clear that I was personally opposed to it. But we also live in these bubbles, right? In other words, so
Right.
you say in this house, we read haaretz.com. And, that would be my household also if we were living in the States. But I also think that in general, this has got nothing to do with the Jewish world. It has everything to do with the modern technological world. We follow the people on Twitter that we agree with, and we
Right.
follow
Sure.
people, whatever. So we live in these echo chambers, and I purposely wanted to break out of the echo chamber. So Moshe happens to be a wonderful human being and a friend. So even though I disagreed with him passionately about judicial reform, he's also brilliant. So when I would interview him, I didn't agree, but you're listening to a very, very, very smart guy. And then the very next week, I interviewed the assistant dean of the Bar Ilan Law School, who was one of the leaders of the opposition to it. And they both sat, they're in the archive. Anybody can go and listen to them. It was important to me to be aware of Israeli politics, but not to be overtly political in the sense that even if people knew what I thought, I was going to bring in lots of different viewpoints. And I've tried to do that ever since. And one of the things that people write and they say is, there's things that I love and there's things that I hate. And I write, okay, then it's working
Right.
because it's exactly what I want. If you don't want to read it, don't read it. You don't want to listen, don't listen. But I want there to be a central place where you can get look, I'm not going to bring in a rabid racist. And I'm not going to probably bring in some crazy wacko from the other side who doesn't. No, I'm not going to do that. But within the normal spectrum of people, I want people to see how vibrant the culture is here politically and culturally. Now, what are you not going to get? So shortly after October 7th, David Grossman, who's now that Amos Oz has passed away, then I would say it was the two of them, but now Amos Oz is unfortunately no longer here. David Grossman is unquestionably Israel's leading novelist, but also very politically active. His son was perhaps the very last soldier killed in the Second Lebanon War. And he refused to shake Olmert's hand, but he got an award. It was a huge brouhaha. But David Grossman is about as much of a poet as a person can be, especially for a person that writes prose. And he gave a speech about what had happened to our soul after October 7th. It wasn't immediate. It was maybe a week or two later. And in the speech, he mentioned two poems by Bialik and two poems by Chaim Guri. Bialik, everybody's heard of. Chaim Guri, most people outside of Israel have not heard of, but he was just as famous here as Bialik. But I had already covered those poems. So when I covered the thing that Grossman wrote, we translated it, and then we kind of hyperlinked to other places where I had already taught some of those poems as they came up in other contexts. So I wanted people to see that there is, if somebody gets up in America and say, I have a dream, right? All I say is I have a dream. Yeah. But you and I are thinking about the same exact thing, right? And if I say to you, we have nothing to fear, I don't even have to say but fear itself. You already know who I'm talking about. That's how a civilization works. And Israeli civilization and Jewish civilization, French civilization, Germans, I mean, they all work that way. But if I had just taken the David Grossman thing, put it into Google Translate, gotten it back, corrected the mistakes, which obviously Google is going to make, that's fine, and then posted it, okay. I mean, it's better than nothing. But where I think the contribution of Israel from the Inside is to try to give a little bit of a commentary. When he says this, he's referring to this. And when he says that, he's referring to that. So what you're not going to get is, you're not going to get the major Israeli intellectuals and artists with words talking internally to Israelis. In a language, not only that it's Hebrew, but a language with associations that only Israelis are going to get. Look, there were also unbelievable stories of heroism on October 7th and since, and there have been unbelievable tragedies. I mean, tragedies beyond description. Some of those make their way into the Israeli press, but here's where the clips come in. I mean, some of these, there was a story that I put up about a guy named Erez Eshel, who I've known for years. Who actually runs a mechina. He runs a program for 18-year-old kids before the army. It's a whole Israeli phenomenon. We've actually done we did a podcast about the whole mechina phenomenon. But he hears on October 7th what's happening, and he grabs his gun, and he grabs an 18-year-old kid who's never served a day in the army, and he says, "You're coming with me," and he gives the kid a gun, and they race down in Erez's car to the Oteif, to the Gaza envelope, and they actually pick up bodies and join the battle. I mean, it's insane. So first of all, in America, nobody takes an 18-year-old kid and drags them into a gun battle. You just don't do that.
Well, yeah.
No, you have them, unfortunately.
Them.
They take place at stadiums and in theaters and all that. And God forbid, if it did happen, you get fired. You get fired for taking a kid into a battle. And here, the kid talked about how now he knows what he wants to do with his life. He wants to devote it to Israel. It was just a fascinating thing. So we translated it and we put it up. So that was a kind of a crazy story. But there are really these unbelievably powerful stories, both in terms of bravery, but also unbelievably sad. And the Israeli press is brilliant. I mean, Israeli TV is as world-class as American TV or whatever. I mean, they're really, they're the tops. But
one of the clips that I don't mean to interrupt you, but one of the clips that I was particularly struck by was shortly after October 7th, when you ran a clip of a newscaster from one of the more right-wing stations, a commentator, and he had been so shaken to his core by what had happened that he went on air and he declared that all Israelis from henceforth were his brothers and sisters, and that he was not going to lob nasty insults at people on the left. Like people, apparently they'd spent a lot of time insulting Shikma Bressler, the leader.
Right.
Yeah. And one of his colleague, and he went on about this for some time, and you had the subtitles, and then one of his colleagues comes on and makes a crack about Shikma Bressler, calls her a Marxist or something. And this guy goes insane and starts screaming at his colleague and says, "You're never coming on this show again. You're dead to me. You don't understand anything.
Get off the set. Get out of the news.
Get off the set. Get off right now." And I was just, first of all, that's a amazing thing to see. It gives you a sense, really, among other things, of how stretched thin everybody is, that they're going to go do that, have those kinds of extreme emotional reactions at all, but also on the air. So that obviously really stuck in my mind, but that speaks to a moment that I bet is no longer really would that happen today? This idea, we're all brothers, never a cruel word again about someone on the other side. Has that lasted?
It's interesting. I just posted a thing, I think within the last few days. There was 3 videos. I forget when it went out, sometime last week, of young people. And one of them specifically said, we can never go back to that toxic discourse. And he was talking about that. So I think in the younger generation especially, there is a real desire to look. We came this close to civil war. I mean, we really did. When Yitzhak Herzog, who is by no means, a blowhard, he's the exact opposite. I mean, he's moderate and thoughtful and just a wonderful human being. My wife pointed out when we were in his office a few months ago for something unrelated, he had the pictures of his kids on the windowsill, and then in identical frames and identical sizes all the way down the windowsill, other Israeli soldiers missing. And Elisheva said to me, "Look at that. They're all they're all his kids." Wow. And I hadn't noticed it. And, you just go into the president's office. And so Yitzhak Herzog is just an exceptional human being. And when he says, we're at the edge and we're heading towards civil war if you don't stop this, then it's serious, because he's just not one of these people who tends to, be hyperbolic in any way. And so, for example, I put up a clip. So I think that people in the younger generation understand that we came this close. And then don't forget, the people that were on opposite sides of this judicial reform thing were in the same tank. And we're in the same tank sometimes for 90 days. It's not a lot of room in a tank. You sleep in the tank. You actually don't often always leave the tank for your personal needs. You might have to deal with that in the tank. You eat in the tank. You're scared to death together in the tank.
So they don't select. Yeah. So these battalions aren't aren't selected.
No, not at all. Not at all. And people have come out and said, look, these guys just defended me. We have a thing coming up in the next few days. of it's an unbelievable one. And it moved me very much. We haven't finished the subtitling yet, so it's not out yet. But a guy he calls himself a BBeast. He's like a hardcore BB guy. And he said, I voted BB always, and I'm going to keep voting BB. Okay, whatever. Very badly wounded in the war, burnt all over, whatever. Is speaking from the hospital bed about a friend of his who's a pilot. And, the pilots were the lefties in the judicial reform thing. They said that they're not going to, whatever. So we had this very close friend. They've been friends forever since early childhood when they grew up in the periphery. But as they got older and their politics began to differ, they began to be stressful. And during judicial reform stuff, they basically said, this has gotten so toxic, we're not going to talk to each other. And they literally stopped talking. And then this guy says, we're on the ground below. And what these pilots are doing to protect us in other words, the soldiers are in touch with the helicopter pilots. And the helicopter will say, there's a sniper over there, be careful, move back 10 yards, 10 meters or whatever. And they do. And then the guy will say they're shooting from that window in that building, and the helicopter will turn around and come back and send the missile in. In other words, it's a very carefully choreographed thing which didn't used to exist because the technology wasn't there. But now there is. And this guy was literally on the verge of tears. He said, I wouldn't be alive if not for those pilots. So how did it get to the point that I wasn't talking to this guy? And this guy says, I heard he was wounded. The minute I could get away from my unit, I went to the hospital to visit him. And they both said, we can't go back to that. We just never, ever, ever can go back to that. Now, does that mean that every Israeli politician is going to turn into sugar and spice and all things nice? No. I mean, look, yesterday they had a conference of Israeli political leaders who want to resettle Gaza. Now, by the way, if we were having a debate, I could take that argument and make a very compelling case. I'm not personally in favor of it, but it's not as insane as people think. It's very pragmatic, but it's not as insane. It's not, because, I mean, it was settled before and there were millions of Gazans there. And they lived separate lives, sort of, but they were getting killed. And so soldiers were getting killed, actually, not settlers. And that's why Sharon pulled out. But I mean, it sounds like a crazy, crazy, crazy idea. It's not as insane as it sounds, but it was the wrong time to have a conference about that. And yesterday, they literally kind of in this religious fervor were dancing. And that's what went around Israeli social media today. Guys are literally getting shot and killed a half an hour drive from here. And you're dancing? Like, what is wrong with you? I don't expect Ben Gvir to change. I don't expect Smotrich to change. And I don't expect Netanyahu for sure to change. What I do really believe, there's a possibility here. There's a possibility that this younger generation, which was so shocked by how we came this close to tearing each other apart, and how all it took was one day. And then they're in the sky and they're in the tanks. Obviously, the tanks was a few weeks later, but you get my point. Their lives depend on each other, and they understand now that our lives really do depend on each other. And it's those kind of clips where that's just never going to make it to America. First of all, to watch a 30 or 20-minute interview, nobody's going to do it. Nobody's going to subtitle it. So that's what we're trying to do here. And I think that when you watch that, it gives you great hope that this younger generation really might start something new.
You think Israel can wait that long?
Well, first of all, we may not have a choice. Second of all, when I'd say young generation, they're not 14.
Right.
They're reservists. They're in their 30s. They're married. They're parents. They're professionals. A lot of the people dying are husbands and fathers. This is not only 18 and 19-year-old kids. God forbid, not to minimize the tragedy of that. But I'm just saying, when people say, I'm getting out of the tank and I'm going to go change the country, they're out of the army. They're out of university. Yeah. They're ready to rock and roll. So I think Israel doesn't have to wait all that long. And I think if one doesn't have faith that can happen, then you might as well pack up and go somewhere. And I don't know where you would go. The world's not that hospitable to people like us, but whatever. But if you don't believe that there's some chance of that happening, then I don't know how you would get out of bed in the morning here. You have to believe that it's possible. And you have to believe that a lot of these young people that we're watching and seeing are going to be transformed by the horror of what's unfolding here. This is a very broken country. It's really, as my son said, it's really hard to understand if you're not here, the brokenness. I mean, there's a little field, well, not a field, it's a playground right around the corner from my house, which is where our shul davens when we daven outside, which we do sometimes. And
So
I have two very vivid memories of, I mean, I've been there hundreds of times, but I have two very vivid memories of being in worship on that playground, with seats set up and the whole thing. The first was on Tisha B'Av, which was 3 days after the Knesset passed the change to the reasonability clause, which everybody saw as the beginning of the actual enactment of the judicial reform.
Oh, the
And people,
reasonability,
right,
the reasonability.
yeah, the reasonability clause. So on Shisha B'Av, on the 6th of Av, and all these signs went out the 6th of Av. I even posted some of them. And on this playground, on Tisha B'Av, traditionally you don't sit in chairs, you sit on the ground. We got there, everybody's done Tisha B'Av before, everybody knows the drill. People sat on the ground and they wept. I'd never seen this in my life. Adults in their 30s and their 40s, most of them much younger than me, literally crying about a vote in the Knesset because they understood we're this close. We are this close. That was August, I guess, right? And then on October 7th, it was Simchat Torah. We're sitting outside because it was gorgeous. And we hear all these booms. And what could that possibly be? And people are kind of a little nervous, but they're mostly kidding with each other. Oh, somebody's having a birthday party, whatever. And then, of course, the sirens go off and okay. And then the sirens went off again later in the morning. And then we understood, okay, something's going on. And then it's a mixed neighborhood. So there's enough people with their phones on and their TVs on, you begin to hear what's going on. And nobody knew anyway what was going on. My point is, if you're just walking by that playground, I'll never be able to walk by that playground and not think of October 7th. And I'll never be able to walk by that playground and not think of Tisha B'Av. And there's the resonance here to place and time and music. We did something, as you probably saw, about this song, The Winter of 73, which was redone several times. And in its newest form, it's the children, or, supposedly the young people of the fall of 23, 50 years later, done by their teachers, thanking them and lauding them and so on and so forth. And it's just, there's parts of this country that you can't get if you don't have this access. And if you do have that access, I think it's very hard not to have some hope here. So can Israel wait that long? I don't think it's going to be that long. How this is going to play out politically is very hard to see. But you can see the political temperature beginning to rise. There was a kind of an informal moratorium on politics. But Bibi announced tonight, it was dinner time here right before I got on with you. And my wife and I were sitting at the table, having dinner together. And of course, looking at our phones. And Bibi just announced today, we are not doing a deal where we give back thousands of Palestinian terrorists and pull the soldiers out. And Hamas has said, that's the only deal that there is on the table. Now, if Hamas is serious, and if Bibi is serious, and then he just consigned all those hostages to death. Now, maybe that's the right military move. I'm not a military person, so I don't know. But that's hard. There are parents of a hostage in our shul. To be in shul with them is just beyond. But that's what I thought of immediately. In fact, they sit in this tent outside the prime minister's house, and there's a Google sheet where they don't want to be alone. So they ask people to sign up to come and sit with them. So my wife and I are on at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning just to go sit with them for an hour, and then somebody else will. They shouldn't be alone. But if I was them and I read the news tonight, so my government is now abandoning my child. You need to, I don't want to get into politics very quickly on Israel from the inside, but at a certain point, there's going to be no choice. If one is going to give people a window in, the claim we're not making a deal like that. It's about this couple in my shul who live a 10-minute walk from here, whose kid, nobody has any idea what the story with him is. So we're trying to give a bit of that also. So I think we are going to get political. I think the moratorium is beginning to wear thin. Also, the war is becoming a slog. This notion that we're going to wipe out Hamas and we're going to get all the hostages back. That was the original promise from both the military and the political echelon. And not looking terribly likely that either of those is going to happen the way we thought. And so again, what I'm trying to do in Israel from the inside is give people what happens when people say something like that? What happens when we realize we may not get any of the hostages back? I was listening to the news in the car 2 days ago, and a woman whose relative is a hostage, she said, look, we know some of the things that are being done to women there every day. Like it's happening day and day and day and day. And apparently the way they know this is because they are tracking the cell phones of these Hamas guys who keep going back to this same spot every day or every other day. Why would they possibly be going back there? So there's all these theories about what they're up to, which is beyond horrifying, beyond horrifying.
You can track these guys by their cell phones and they can't get them? Wow.
Well, they're surrounded. They could be underneath the ground. They could be surrounded by hostages. We know where Sinwar apparently is exactly, but in any event, but why do I mention this? So then this woman says on the radio, we're running out of time for these hostages also because a lot of them are going to need abortions. And that was my case also. I was driving and I'm like, I never thought of that. How did I not think of that? And she said, we're in
still, how many of the hostages who are still in there are female? Because a lot of people here.
A lot. I don't know the exact number, but it's dozens.
But it's not just.
And they're young. They're young. They're not 5 years old, but they're not 85 years old. They're 20s, 30s. So you hear something like that on the radio, and my question to myself as I was driving always is, I didn't do anything with this particular one, but people outside Israel need to understand that that's what's on the radio here. Like I didn't put that piece in for whatever reason, but that's what I want people to get from Israel from the inside. I want them to know you're driving along, you're waiting to make a left-hand turn, and this woman, I can vision right where I was, and this woman says that, and you realize, how did I never think of that? Like, what's wrong with me? How did I never think that there's women in there? It's 117 days. That's 3 point something months. Yeah, we got to get them out really fast. And, there's all sorts of stories here about the women who were brought out and what their mental condition is. And there's rumors of people, trying to take their own lives after they got out. I mean, there's horrible stories here. And I don't want Israel from the inside to be a depressing thing. That's why I put in lots of really unbelievably positive and optimistic stuff. But it's complicated. And I want people to feel the resonance of the complexity.
So I was going to ask you this earlier. I don't know if we want to end on this note because I was going to ask you about comedy, because some of the things you've put on that have been you often say on the Substack that you can't really understand a country unless you understand what they're all laughing at on the news, and those BBC parodies, things like that. Right. So can you do that really quickly, and then I want to ask you, we're almost out of time, but I kind of wanted to ask you, just take a step back and talk about your own journey, because you crossed this bridge, as an adult, not as a child, to become an Israeli. So can you do both those things in, 5 minutes?
I'll do it less than 5 minutes. So we put a thing out today on today's podcast. I interviewed a young woman who happens to be a graduate of Shalem College where I work, but she is herself now an attorney. And she and some other people built an organization to represent the needs of the women who are at home to the Knesset. So that's, for example, that I didn't know until I talked to her. If you're a nurse, she's not. But if you're a nurse and you work night shifts, and now your husband's away and you can't work night shifts because your kids need somebody at home, so you work the day shift, that's a 60% cut in your salary because they pay a lot more for the night shift. Now, who's thinking about that? Who's thinking about you're also trying to keep your husband's business going? And if you're going to go try to meet your husband because he's getting 5 hours off, and they do that sometimes, so you go meet him wherever he is, who's taking care of your kids and all of that kind of stuff. So I interviewed her today about this organization called the Wives of Reservists, etc. And we put that up today. She's wonderfully thoughtful and articulate. But I wanted people to understand it's not just this woman. So we put up a thing from Eretz and the Hederet about all these women singing this song. It's very cute. And it's about basically we've had enough. The first 2 days, it was great to be without our husbands. And then it started to be not so much fun. And now they say in this song, if you guys don't get Sinwar, we're going to go get him. Right. And it's obviously, and they show these women marching in with helicopters over them. And that's just a way of saying if it's on Eretz and the Hederet, then obviously the whole society is thinking about this. It's not just this one woman or the 15 women who are organizing this organization. I wanted to show the humor because the fact that it makes it to the equivalent of Saturday Night Live, it's more or less Israel's Saturday Night Live. Okay. If it's the first skit on Saturday Night Live, then it's something everybody's thinking about. When they did a Hanukkah thing, and the Chanukiah had 30 candles in it. 30 paces, and somebody says, "What are you doing?" And the guy says he's dressed up as the I think it was Gallant, the defense minister. He goes, "Well, I promised Biden we'd be out by the end of Hanukkah." So there's this, Chanukiah that has 30 days in it. Obviously, we've gone long since that. But these humor things, I mean, Israelis are laughing also because you have to. And the country is very broken. People burst out into tears at the drop of something. When we heard about these 21 guys who were killed in this building, I was at work today talking to a woman who two of the families are from her neighborhood. And she was telling me how she responded 2 weeks ago or last week, whenever it was. And she teared up just today at the office. I mean, there's plenty of pain to go around, but the country's also trying to live. My wife and I went to a chamber music concert last week because you have to live. And in a certain way, by the way, the people at the front are doing what they're doing so we can live. So the humor is an important window. What was the second part? I apologize.
No, so actually, I think so. You can answer this at more leisure. So I wanted to ask you.
Oh, my own personal journey.
Well, let me ask it more elaborately. I mean, this is all about not being able to see across the divide. And I went back and I also reread in preparation for this year 2019 book, We Stand Divided, about the fundamental divides between American Jews and Israeli Jews. And I have to say, although it's from a different universe, it holds up pretty well.
I unfortunately think that it does. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, you made Aliyah as an adult. You already had a career and a PhD and a family, and you've obviously gone all the way over. So tell me, can you talk about that a little bit? I mean, first of all, why you made Aliyah, but secondly, I know you wrote a whole book about this. It's just a wrap up.
Fine.
But
Totally
also,
fine.
secondly, is there a point when you felt, okay, I'm a real Israeli now. I'm not an American anymore. I'm looking at this as an Israeli does.
So yes, we made Aliyah because my wife wanted to make Aliyah. That's the short, but also 100% true version of the story. There's obviously more to it, but we don't have time. She'd always wanted to live here. We came for a sabbatical. She loved it. We'd moved around a bit for my career. She really wanted to give it a shot. It was her turn. And I wasn't passionate about the idea, but I wasn't opposed to the idea. Our kids were thriving on that sabbatical. I said, okay, we'll give it a shot. And I obviously, over the course of time, really fell in love with the place and our lives here and so forth. We've been here for a quarter of a century. All of our kids have done the army. All of our kids went to university here. We pay the hefty taxes that everybody else pays. But I think in a certain way, we became Israelis now. Because I was actually walking down the stairs from work, coming home just today. I had this thought, my son's out right now, and he's going back in soon. And it's very scary. And you can't feel sorry for yourself because there's hundreds of thousands of families who feel the same exact way. But then I had this thought, if you'd stayed in LA, your kid would not be going back in. And he would not be worried about whether or not his two young children, God forbid, would remember him. I had this crazy thought walking down the stairs. And that's when I said to myself, that's when you're in the boat. So when he was in the army, it was everybody does the army, and it was relatively peaceful. And what he did was dangerous, but it wasn't like this. And I just had that thought today. I can't keep him out, and he would never not go in if he was asked to go in. But it's very, very frightening. And I think in a certain kind of a way, the question everybody asks is these days, not how are you, which they do ask, but how many do you have in? That's the question. How many do you have? We have friends who had 5 in combat in Gaza at exactly the same time. How they functioned, because we only had 1 in, and we were zombies walking around the house, looking at each other, kind of talking to each other, pretending to read, but not really focusing on anything and not sleeping for sure. So when you have that kid in, and he's the father of 2 very young kids, and you just got to defend this place. Ironically, 25 years in, I thought on the way out of work today, walking down the stairs, it's real. So, I mean, if you would ask me this question yesterday, I would have had a different answer, but it literally happened like 3 or 4 hours ago when I was coming home from work.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. That can't be easy, to share it, never mind to experience it. But so I mean, in some way, okay, I think we don't have a lot of questions, but we have one or two so far. Let's go to that. And then if we have a little more time, I'll come back. I have lots of questions, of course, but let me just say how much I appreciate your coming on and talking. And, we do, one of the things I took away from your book was that, having differences, might make it hard to communicate, but understanding that they're there makes it easier. So
Right.
focusing on the gap makes it easier to discuss, to make a bridge. So with that in
Right.
mind, let's see if we got some questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much. A few people have asked, what do Israelis know about what's going on here in the United States? Kind of the reverse.
Mhm.
Do they know how much and the rise of anti-Semitism, what's happening on campuses, and especially with all the pro-Palestinian rallies and calling for intifada? How much do they know, and how much does it affect them? Do they care when they're in the middle? You're in the middle of what you're doing right now.
It's a great question. In the 25 years that I've lived here, I have never seen so much coverage of American Judaism. When Claudine Gay became president of Harvard University, I doubt very much that she thought she would figure loudly in Israeli newspapers. But there was her picture in Congress, the word context, being in brackets, heksher is the Hebrew word, but, contextual, people were explaining what it meant. Israelis are actually brokenhearted about what's happening in America. They really can't believe it. They feel, by the way, very supported by American Jews right now. I think how long that's going to last is a very complicated question, but it's another time. But they feel right now very supportive. People are coming in on missions. People are going to farms and working. And we've been running an Airbnb, it feels like. I mean, we've just had, our guest room, people leave, we change the sheets, another couple comes, and they're getting up and they're going at 6 o'clock in the morning and they're going to farms. They're not hanging out and going to restaurants.
And can I
So
just say that there's a group, I'm loosely associated with a group that has been raising money specifically for those women that you talked about and who need support with families. So, there's a certain amount of information, going back and forth, but go on.
So Israelis feel very, very supported. I was meeting with a student today about something. He just got out of Gaza. He looked at me and he said, I am telling you every single thing that I wore, the pants, the socks, well, not the pants, but the boots, the socks, the vest, it was all bought by American Jews. He said, none of us in Gaza took that for granted. By the way, that's a huge problem, that you need people from a different country to buy your soldiers their equipment. That's a huge issue. We obviously have a few military issues to clean up here over the course of time. But people feel really unbelievably supported. But even more than that, they feel brokenhearted for what American Jews are going through. It's in the press all the time. It's being covered. They're very concerned, not out of a selfish way. They just feel whatever the complexities of this relationship have been for years, and it's been very complex and not always pretty. Those are Jews, and they are living through their own horror right now. There's a tremendous sympathy, concern, and a lot more knowledge than there was 4 months ago.
Mm-hmm. And what about these pro-Palestinian rallies that are taking place, calling for intifada, from people who are living in the United States and not even living in Israel?
Look, Israelis understand that. Israelis love to see these American social media clips where there's somebody in Manhattan. I just saw one of them. We didn't translate it because it's in English, so it wasn't our thing. But there's a woman holding a Palestinian flag somewhere in Manhattan. You can just tell because of the taxis that it's Manhattan, and she's saying, "From the mountains to the sea, Palestine will be free." So a guy goes up to her with a microphone and says, "Which mountains?" And she's thinking, and she goes, "Oh, no, the river to the sea." And he says, "Okay, which river?" And she has no idea, right? I mean, in other words, people understand here, this is actually not about Israel at all. This is about Jews. And anti-Semitism, like a virus, and we all know virus metaphors now because of COVID, viruses morph, but they don't usually go away. And so if anti-Semitism at one point is based on theology in the Middle Ages, and then under Nazism, it's based on pseudoscience, it's now based on nationalism or anti-nationalism or that sort of thing, but it's the same hate. It's the same exact hate. And the same exact hate that made Jews flee before the Holocaust, that got Jews to flee Europe and go either to the Lower East Side or to Palestine. That's the hate on the campuses of Harvard and Columbia and the streets of New York and Los Angeles. Israelis get that. There's no "I told you so," and there's no "well, now do you get it?" There's none of that. None of that. But there is, I think, a deep-seated sense that those early Zionist thinkers were right. They were right that this hatred does not know borders. And Bialik himself said to American Jews, "You think it's all good and rosy over there." I think it was his words, I forget who it was, "but you will be drinking one day from the same trough that we're drinking from." Wrote it 110 years ago, 20 years ago. So it's a very strong statement, but it's tragically not ridiculous. And so I think people here understand it's really, at the end of the day, not about Israel. It's about Jews, and it's old. It's thousands of years old, and it's never going to go away. It doesn't mean we shouldn't try to fight it. We should, although I'm not sure how, but that's another conversation for a different day. They're very concerned, and they're very aware of what's going on, both in all of the ways, Suzanne, that you asked about.
And as we wrap up, a lot of people want to know, what can American Jews be doing, not being there? How can we continue to support what's happening in Israel and the Israeli people?
It's a great question. And look, I understand from all of our friends and family who are there that there's a certain feeling of impotence, that you really want to do something, but at the end of the day, I mean, you're not going to pick up an M16 and hop in a tank. That you're not going to do, right? So look, I think there are certain obvious things. There are amazing organizations that need support. I'll just give you one, right? Ogen is an organization which we're going to profile in Israel from the inside shortly, which is actually trying to give short-term loans to businesses that are floundering because their owners and workers are, in tanks, and they're going to come back, and their stock is going to be ruined, and they won't have sold anything, and so they're giving short-term loans. So money does matter. Money doesn't go in just to a huge heap. Kibbutzim are going to have to be rebuilt, and some of it the government will do, but some of it won't. So money really does matter, and I think we're going to cover in Israel from the Inside shortly some of the kinds of things that are sort of out of the norm, but that really deserve, because they're serious organizations. The money's not being wasted, and it's making a difference. We're going to cover that. So money matters. As I said earlier, the presence of people here, for those who can do it, and obviously not everybody can, really does mean a lot to Israelis. It's the only people other than the evacuees who are in the hotels. And I went to the States for a day last week, and I was talking to my taxi driver. He said, "There's nobody." Because the evacuees are not using taxis. So the hotels might not look empty, but as far as taxi drivers are concerned, it's empty. So people being here does make a difference. I think being vocal about support, which was not easy in America. I think Israelis will feel now, like, we know that you're actually making yourself, if not physically vulnerable, certainly emotionally vulnerable and socially vulnerable, maybe even professionally vulnerable. I don't know. But to be out there on the front lines with us, this is about the Jewish people. This was not only about Israel. This was a pogrom. And you didn't need to do the horrible thing. You could have just killed everybody, but you didn't need to mutilate them and do things that I won't even mention now. It was about debasing the Jew. It wasn't about taking over territory. It was about debasing the Jew. And that's what pogroms were. What were they trying to accomplish? They weren't trying to steal their villages or their money or their things or their houses. They wanted to debase them. And that's where we are. We're back where we were in 1881. We're back where we were in, 1904 in Kishinev. And so for American Jews to say, no, we get what this is about, and we're going to be on the front lines. You want to have a Palestinian protest? Go right ahead. But we're going to be on the other side. We're going to be polite. We're not going to break the law, but we're going to make it clear. And here's, maybe we end with this. This is, at the end of the day, not about the Jews. This is about the West. If you cannot defend the right of people, this is not to say that the Palestinians don't have a legitimate cause writ large. This is not about that. This is about rape and murder and burning people alive. That's got nothing to do with the Palestinian cause. And it's got nothing to do with Islam, I hope. This is about something much sicker. It's an extension of ISIS. It's an extension of Boko Haram. It's an extension of Al-Qaeda. If the West gives in to this, there's no future for the West. We are the proverbial canary in the coal mine. And if the West cannot stand up for Israel, not because Israel's always right, and not because, Israel, the Jewish state has always comported itself the way it should, because no country does, And not because you love us, just because in this particular moment, it really actually is, without diminishing the suffering of Palestinians in any way. And it is massive suffering in Gaza, massive. But it actually, at the end of the day, is about good versus evil. And if the West can't stand with good, then the West is over. And if I was a Jew living in America, I would be countering those pro-Palestinian protesters in favor of Israel, but mostly actually in favor of the future of the West, in favor of the future of the world that I would hope that my grandchildren and great-grandchildren would still want to grow up in. So there's money, there's coming, there's protesting, there's political activism. Sometimes I know that doesn't feel like enough. People feel they wish they could do more, but it's a lot. And as I said, Israeli Jews feel very supported right now by American Jews. And I hope and pray that we can maintain some of that even after, God willing, this crisis, which is not going to be over so soon, but whenever it is over, we can maintain, we can, just like we learned in Israel, we came this close to the abyss. We came pretty close to the abyss between American Jews and Israel too. Let's see if we can build some bridges that we weren't thinking about building 4 months ago.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Wow.
Thank you. And on that note, we do have to wrap up. Again, Daniel's Substack is Israel from the Inside. I do want to say one person wrote in and said that they have been a subscriber for a while, and it is absolutely superb and invaluable. So
That's very nice. Thank you very
encourage
much.
everybody to go check it out. I've put the link in the chat. I will send a follow-up email that will include a link to this program that people can share, as well as a link to the Substack. Again, please go to momentmag.com, where you can sign up for this week's program on Thursday about Yemen and others that are coming up in the coming weeks. Again, thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Amy, for this really good conversation, and we'll see everybody next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you both very much. A pleasure to be
Thank
with
you.
you.
We'll be thinking of you.
Thank you.